My name is Madeline Hagan, and I'm a historian with the firm Historical Research Associates in Portland, Oregon. Today, I am interviewing Gayle Rothrock on behalf of the Historic Trust for their Officers Row Memories Oral History Project. We are recording in the Marshall House on Officers Row in Vancouver, Washington. Today is November 5th, 2024. Gayle, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Gayle Rothrock, and I'm a resident on Officers Row in the one oddball apartment unit that is suitable for people with handicaps. And I've been there 11 years, and I was drawn to living there when I felt I could no longer live in a home and really wanted to reaffiliate in some wonderful way with Officers Row and the complex over here. So I was first introduced to Officers Row when I was a child growing up in Portland, and my parents wanted to come over and visit the relatives, the Philpotts and the Capels, and also make a graveside visit. But they liked driving through what we know as Officers Row, and believe me, things weren't in very great condition in the late 40s by then. And then the second time I had occasion to have familiarity with Officers Row, I had been hired on the teaching faculty of the Evergreen State College, who was operating a program for juniors and seniors so they could complete a baccalaureate degree. And their rented space was in a house that was 2 doors west of the Grant House. So I worked on Officers Row when the houses weren't in terrific condition. and that was in the late 70s. And then a work assignment took me to Olympia, and I returned here the latter half of 1986 and was contacted by the city manager through some friends. And he said, you've been working at the legislature, you worked for Congress, you've done lobbying work. The city would like to hire you to help make sure we stand a chance of getting a state appropriation that will help us meet the budget needs we have in order to effect a recovery of Officers Row. And so I took the assignment.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the conditions on the row before the rehabilitation process.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give me some details? What do you remember about the conditions?
Well, you never knew quite what might peel off the ceiling and fall down on you or your colleagues or your students. Door hinges would get out of sorts easily. In some parts of a house, of course, there were some odd and musty smells. And the Veterans Administration was supposed to take care of the exterior of the homes, but I guess it was hard for them to do that. And so oftentimes the grass would go up to a foot long, and we would be bushwhacking our way aground. And since the name of the college was the Evergreen State College, we had a little joke and posted a sign that said the Overgrown State College. But it was just that, you couldn't control the heating very well. The lighting was okay, but it was obvious that this was something that was available, that was close to Clark College, and at what was considered an affordable price, I should say. It was an affordable price. And so, but you felt a sadness. Yes, you were trying to give life to some of these buildings, and the Grant House was experimenting with operating as a museum. And so it was nice to be able to go over there and see what they were up to. I just looked on the upside of it and said, this is what we have to deal with. This is how we're going to deliver an education and classes in it. But when you did hear something, you knew there was a chance that something could fall on your head. So I said, yes, these need help.
Mm-hmm.
These definitely need help.
You said were you born in Portland or grew up in Portland?
Yes.
How did you make your way to Clark County?
After college and working for the U.S. Congress for an additional 3 years or so, I felt that I'm really a Pacific Northwest person. I think I need to get back to the Northwest. And I ended up coming to Seattle because I'd been admitted to a graduate program in public administration at the University of Washington. So I studied there and did a job doing public interest lobbying, and then got hired there for an additional public interest lobbying assignment for a public agency that was operating a transit system, but also a water pollution control system. And then I yearned for some changes and was drawn to Olympia and worked there, worked for the legislature for a while. And then circumstances were such that I got married, and it turned out to be a good idea to move down to Vancouver. And I felt comfortable since, as a child, having grown up in Portland, I was completely comfortable with coming to Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And little did I know how much change I was going to be witnessing in those next several years.
Yeah, so when the ideas, or when stuff started percolating
yes.
about the rehabilitation,
yes.
what was your initial response?
First of all, yes, this really needs to happen. This honors a profoundly important history in the Northwest, not just Washington, but Washington, Oregon, part of Idaho. The presence of Native peoples and their encampment, and then the Hudson Bay Company deciding that that waterfront down there would be a good place to establish their furs trading company. And then with the settling of the border between the United States and Canada in 1846, a negotiation which allowed the Hudson Bay Company to remain in a guest status, operating things for up to 10 years, but the Army, the U.S. Army, was going to be sent in order to occupy this space, whatever buildings there were, and then add what was needed. And at this very time, a lot of people were migrating in their covered wagons to Oregon country. And so it became part of the Army's mission to make sure that they could make safe passage. And I think this has so much American history, so much regional history, and it's something that simply couldn't be let go. And so we needed to do our best in modern times to conserve the spaces, but be able to make economic, reasonable use of them so that you could have them go on for as long as anybody had the wit and the will to keep up Officers Row and any of the other buildings.
Yeah. Had you always been interested in history?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Ever since I was a girl.
Mm-hmm.
And
do you think it was like visiting places like Officers Row that inspired that?
It was that, and having grown up across the river also, I could see a number of historic spots in the wonderful Willamette Valley. And we had relatives over in eastern Washington and relatives in Idaho and whatnot. So, and they were interested in history as well. So I was around people who respected an interest in history and were willing to show me some sites. And then I went on and studied it more in college until I was an American Studies major with an emphasis on history and governance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the rehabilitation kind of starts. You're contacted. Can you help us with the funding, with state funding?
Mm-hmm.
How does that process go?
Well, the key thing, of course, was to visit with the city manager and then refresh my recollections of things I'd been reading in the newspaper or hearing from friends about the challenge of figuring out what uses would work in here. Of course, the first effort was just to defeat any other takers other than the city, a public benefit authority, from getting their hands on these houses in particular. So I kind of educated myself on that so that I was ready for the meeting with the city manager. And he just said, we know that you've worked for the legislature. We know you've been a public interest lobbyist. We know you worked for Congress. And we need help. We cannot put this budget together unless we can get something close to 4 million, unless we can recalculate, something else. Well, I did know several legislators from this area, and I knew how you would pursue something like that, which is to make sure that the men and women who are in your local delegation are absolutely thinking that getting an appropriation like this from the state's Historic Preservation Fund, at that time, it had to go directly through action of the legislature and then get signed by the governor. But you knew what it would take. And if you don't have a friendly local delegation of senators and representatives, you're likely not going to get very far. So 2 gentlemen stand out in my mind, both of whom have passed away. But there was a gentleman from North Clark County, Al Bauer, and he was a Democrat. And there was a gentleman, what can't I think of his last name? Well, I had it on my tongue just yesterday. He was a Republican and a longtime senator from the Kamas-Washougal area. And they liked each other also and were respectful each other. And then through working with them and me coming also, sometimes I would just stay here and sit in on the meetings that Mr. Macht and Steve Burdick and the staff were having. And so I could see what the advocacy was and the arguments were on how it should be fixed, under what circumstances, and what ultimate uses do we think it's really going to work. So, and that was good, which meant I didn't remain ignorant in any way about it, and was able to work companionably particularly with the senators and representatives from our area. And we prevailed. By the end of the session, there was a significant appropriation, which helped the city balance the budget of roughly $11 million.
And what was your pitch?
That this was of profound historic meaning and importance, and a remarkable chance to get some housing and some businesses and some public spaces made available with respect and reverence for an incredible historic scene. And that it really did resonate with them, and a number of their colleagues said, oh yes, Fort Vancouver and the Hudson Bay Company and so forth is such a profound part of Northwest history. Because, of course, people who were stationed here would often be outstationed somewhere else in what we know as Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, Idaho, and what have you, because of the fortifications and small fort systems. So many legislators said, yes, yeah, that's important, and I feel touched by it. I remember Fort so-and-so or Camp so-and-so that really got its start from the leadership at Fort Vancouver.
And do you remember any notable opposition?
Not really notable. There's the usual opposition in a legislature when people just feel called to oppose anything that looks like it isn't, food, clothing, or shelter, or a roadway. There's always just a certain amount of that, but those people were gradually persuaded that this was a profoundly important project. I don't know what the final vote was, but you can always expect that people are doing it. And then they'll say, well, I think there's important things that happened in my area. So we would quote them. Well, for example, Fort Vancouver had sent out people in your area, and there was a sub-fort or a substation there. It was just one of those things where it was classic. I don't want to spend any more money, than we don't have to. But in the end, there were no unhappy people, and there certainly were a lot of happy people in Vancouver when it became known that each of the pieces of the funding package was finally coming together in a way that said, go!
So getting money from the state, what were other sources of money for the project?
Well, there were different accounts that the city had, or sub-funds, and they could do some temporary borrowing for several years, and the city had bonding capacity, which most cities in America do. It's just how much do you have? So they knew that they would have to float some bonds, and then the rent that would be paid by businesses and residents here would help pay off the bonds. But there were even things like at some schools, they even had little drives of pennies and nickels where if children wanted to give something to help this Officers Row project, they could do that. So, which really made the whole thing, have more human interest. But those were largely the sources. And the fact that the United States government, under a longstanding federal law, needed to pass these properties to a public benefit authority, and they did it for $1 for all 21 houses, that helped a lot. That it wasn't a matter of forcing a purchase at, let's say, a couple $100,000. So when you put it all together, you had a package of sponsors, but certainly public authority and the goodwill of the legislature on that was perhaps the strongest part of it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned community support. What do you think Officers Row or maybe Fort Vancouver at large means to the Vancouver community, either at the time or now?
I think people just simply understood that some place that had so many open spaces, so many extraordinary trees and plants and what have you, that had clearly been around for a couple of hundred years, people felt it was a place they could go and have some recreation time. There's still lots of people here walking the dogs or walking themselves, and that you could learn something by seeing structures that were built. If it was Officers Row, mostly in the 19th century and the early 20th century. If you wandered down below Howard House, you would see the most recent structures, which were 1929, 1930, the non-commissioned officers' brick duplexes. If you looked at the artillery barracks, you were seeing a 1909 structure. This is interesting to people. And I think it was like, yeah, this is ours. This is here. This is where we live. And it happened, of course. It was close to the bridge, close to what was Highway 99 and then became Interstate 5. So you could get in and out of here. You could show guests a place like this. But most of all, you could just be incredibly proud that you were in a city that honored these things.
Yeah.
Before we continue, Maddie, I'm just going to shut that door in a second here.
Okay.
Someone talking. Excuse me.
Do you want me to wait?
Yeah, if you just go.
Okay. Drama. Always. I visited as a kid all the time.
Did you? Yeah, I was glad that my parents had said, well, we're going to stop here and then at the cemetery before we went to see the relatives in their house north of town.
Good. Okay. I had a great question. Now, oh my goodness. Tell me how you became a docent.
Oh, when I decided that because of a disability that I had and was going to be permanent, and I really wanted to see if there was any possibility of living on Officers Row, and it worked out that I could rent the handicap apartment, and that was about 11 years ago. And of course, that meant I was right across the lawn from the Marshall House, a place where I had attended the special anniversary celebration of the Bidikoff landing, a place where I'd sat for meetings for ages. And so I just simply walked over here, and there was a person on duty who was a docent herself, but also kind of a house manager. And I explained who I was and that I had just moved in across the lawn. And I wonder if they need any assistance with something like docent work, if you give tours of the ground floor. So she just asked me a little bit more about my background and promptly said, could you start tomorrow? So I guess, I guess you could say that was a happy beginning. And you always need people who, and because I just lived across the lawn, I could come over in an emergency. Sometimes I came over when they were having a wedding, and maybe in the late afternoon or something, and the people who were having the wedding would say, "Gee, I wish we knew more about the Marshall House," and they'd call me up and say, "Could you please come over here, and talk to these people about that?" So I not only took daytime shifts, but occasionally I was able to share with people who had rented the house for some sort of an event, maybe 10 minutes of story about the Marshall House.
Yeah. What did you like about being a docent?
I think it's because I like sharing stories, and I thought there were fascinating things about the Marshall House that people might want to know. What about the grand staircase? Well, that had to be shipped around the Horn, and come all the way up and through the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't like this is something you could go get down the street or have made locally. I just like sharing stories that are interesting, and you have to make sure that you can adjust it for a child's level of understanding if a family's there, or let's say a group of young people. Here's Mrs. Jones' third grade class. Or adjust it for a person who's a veteran and they're very proud to come in here, and they're going to want to know more things about how the military occupied life here. So you have to be prepared to have various aspects of story that you can share. You don't share the same thing all the time. You look at what your visitors' needs are.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the staircase. Where is it originally from? Italy?
It was made in the Northeast, in probably Boston,
Okay.
or whatever, where there were serious furniture making going on.
Very
So
interesting. Tell me some more stories about the Marshall House.
well, also this particular mantle had to be brought in. It wasn't something a local carpenter could carve, and we had actually before my time, they had established a relationship with Oregon Historical Society, saying, "What have you got in the way of some wonderful landscape paintings of the Northwest that you aren't really displaying now, and it's just part of your collection?"
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice to tell people, "Gee, there was a loan, kind of a long-term loan from the Oregon Historical Society, so that we could also see some scenery of those earlier years when the Hudson Bay Company was here and the Army was here." And then I would say, "Do you know what the design is on the rug?" And a lot of people don't know that that's a fleur-de-lis, or the lily. So just even spending a few moments saying, yes, that was considered to be a very fine carpet design. And then I would call their attention to the floor, because the wonderful people who worked on the rehab of this house had been able to save the floor. I mean, it took some real work, but they did. And then I would talk about the magic doors that led into the main rooms here, and how the doors were in hiding inside the wall, which of course children in particular like that. So then, you get to demonstrate that. So it's delightful to do things like that. And then when you take them into the other parlor room, you could say, this is where the ladies and the children spent a lot of time. And the men would come in here, and any men visitors from up in the gorge or across from Portland, they could all meet and share their business, or their monkey business, or just their cigars. So that room was also one where we kept pictures of George Marshall, and we had pictures of the 3 Soviet flyers, because that was one of the rooms where General Marshall and his wife conducted some of the ceremonies, as well as standing by the front door. It was agreed a long time ago that the upstairs should really be occupied by 1 or 2 business offices, and then offices of elected public officials. So no going upstairs. So, this is the first thing you establish with them, is that this is a ground floor tour. And then I would just explain about the dining room, and when this house was first built and some of the other houses, there was only one little tiny hotel in Vancouver. Well, that couldn't take a lot of visitors, so people would stay here and have their meals here. And then I'd take them into Marshall's office, and the dial telephone was a big hit. So you wanted to make sure that children actually knew what a dial telephone were. So here are the adults standing there going, oh my God, I didn't realize that my grandson doesn't know what that is. So there's ways that you can have story, you can have a little fun, and they can learn a little history, but in an enjoyable way.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? Can you describe to me the feeling of seeing Officers Row after its rehabilitation? What did that feel like?
I guess a relief in one sense, because I had seen it before and worked in one of the houses before, having seen it as a child when it was really kind of forlorn. And I just felt like lots of work. This has taken a lot of time, and it's all worth it. It's all worth it, because this is going to make housing, business space, and some other public spaces available for people to enjoy, and that meets the needs of a city.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, we're evoking history and always finding a way, whenever there's the least little opportunity, to tell a historic story, but to do it safely, because now it was safe to use the buildings.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that people continue to appreciate Officers Row?
On the whole, yes. And I think it helps that it is also associated with the Fort Vancouver Historic National Park, and that there's just so much land, and there's a lot of exhibits and a lot of special things going on, like the archaeology school down there in the summer. And all these things will also bring a person up to the row, or bring people up to the row. So I still hear a lot of comments, when I'm out and about, of people saying, "Oh yes, I so love to go down there." So I've never run into anyone who said that was a poor public investment. I mean, the bonds were getting paid off. It was financed honestly, and no scandals. So
Yeah. Can you tell me about what the community is like living on the row?
Oh, just I guess people who themselves appreciate some history, and for a variety of reasons. They may like have needed to be quite close to a bus line. They love being close to downtown, because not me, I can't walk it, but a lot of people can easily walk in town when the weather, is pretty good. So, and they just say, if I'm driving my car, I can get anywhere. I can go north, I can go east, I can go west, or I can get on that bridge and go over to Portland. So I think people just find it convenient. We don't have any children who live on Officers Row, so it is all, for the most part, middle-aged and older adults.
Yeah, and do you know your neighbors?
I know a couple of the people who are in the business in the front part of Point North Consulting, in the front of the house, and I'm acquainted with some of the other people. Mostly we see each other at the mailbox, although now, since I'm a little worse off, we're having my mail delivered to the deck door. Or even if you're I've been able to learn how to drive again. So even if you're just going in and out of your automobile, there's a friendly exchange.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people who actually have some close friends, and I think in some cases they were friends that somebody talked into moving in here. So they're sharing a lot of time with each other.
That's really lovely.
Mm-hmm.
What's your favorite house on the row? Is it the Marshall House?
Probably, yeah. And probably because of my long association with it in different things, and the fact that now I happen to live right across the lawn from it. But I enjoy going into the Grant House. I don't go upstairs. I don't go upstairs in any house. But yeah, this is probably a dear old favorite.
Yeah. Can you tell me about any favorite memories you had while working and fighting for the rehabilitation?
I think just realizing how seriously and yet creatively, with great professionalism, the planning team, the design teams were working. It was a wonderful thing to sit in on the meetings and see that nobody was giving this short shrift. Everyone was taking this task seriously. They knew it was special, and they knew that it had to come out right. Also knew that if you'd made too many of the interior townhouse units were starting out with residential, and too few were offering a business space or a space for a nonprofit, that you could, if the trends were different in the environment, you could make an exchange on that and offer a few more offices and not so much in the way of housing. There aren't a lot of places that exist in this city or anywhere else where you can actually, given a little bit of time, shift something so it would work as either a business space or a living space. And I do know that over time there have been some adjustments. No one perfectly estimates what you might actually need for the housing. Nobody knew that we were going to have, thousands of units of housing eventually that would be built downtown and close into the center of town, and that would run some competition with the housing that was here. But I think they sussed it out pretty well.
Yeah. What do you think the legacy of Officers Row is? What do you hope for its future?
That it continue to be a place that evokes both memory and specific examples of things that were once part of life here, and yet offers something that modern people need. We need space, we need housing, we need business space, we need space for the nonprofits. So as long as and if it's kept up, of course, you really need to keep things up. And hopefully the lesson about letting things go over time and then seeing just exactly how much money it costs to try to make something out of it, hopefully was a permanently learned lesson.
Are there any questions that you wished I'd asked you during our interview?
Not that I can think of. I do reflect on my time of active work here in 86, 87, and 89, 90, and then my service for 8 years as a docent. I do look back on it with rather remarkable memories. I can't think of anything else right now that I wished you would ask me. I realize mine is perhaps an unusual story, having actually worked in one of the buildings when it was still dilapidated, and then having the privilege of being an advocate for additional couple of millions in public funding, because this is what the Northwest is about. Along with other things the Northwest is about, it's also about all this, and we mustn't lose touch with that.
Gayle, thank you.
Yes, thank all of you for your hospitality today.